Residents in a Toronto riding head to the polls tomorrow to vote in a much watched and talked about by-election. Toronto-St. Paul's has been a Liberal stronghold for more than 30 years. Former Cabinet Minister Carolyn Bennett held the seat from 1997 until earlier this year. She's now the ambassador to Denmark. But there are signs that this year it could be a tight race with the Conservatives. Could the Liberals risk losing that riding? And what would that mean for the Prime Minister's future? David Coletto is the founder and CEO of Abacus Data. Eric Grenier is a polls and elections analyst at the Writ.ca. And I spoke to them both earlier about what to expect in tomorrow's big race. David and Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
So I know that there is no poll done inside the riding, but I know you both have looked at a lot of numbers and have a sense of things. So I just want to start with where you think things stand right now and sort of what you'll be watching for on Monday night. I'll start with you, David.
Well, I think, given where the Liberals are nationally in the polls in Ontario and even in Toronto when we take a deeper dive, my sense is that, the Liberals are still the favorites to win on Monday, all else being equal. I kind of feel like they would win by 4 or 5 points. But I think there's a number of factors that are unique to by-elections and perhaps unique to this by-election that I think leads us to even a chance that the Conservatives will win, whether that's the high proportion of Jewish Canadians in the riding, who may not like the government's handling of the Middle East. It's a wealthier riding. And as we know from our polling, Liberals aren't all that enthusiastic right now about Mr. Trudeau, about the government, and Conservatives are deeply motivated to get out and vote. So I think there's a lot of variables that point to this being a close election, probably closer than it should normally be, given that Toronto-St. Paul's hasn't gone Conservative in over 30 years.
I mean, Eric, just the fact that we're talking about it, frankly, I don't think I'd be doing a panel about a by-election on a normal weekend. So the fact that it is up for discussion is kind of sends a good signal about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why this by-election is so significant. It's because it was a 24-point margin in the last election. Normally, a 24-point win is a safe seat. The fact that this is not necessarily a safe seat is really what is signaling what is so problematic for the Liberals right now. Because as David said, if you do look at those polls that are done across the province in Ontario, for example, and you apply the same kind of swing that we've seen in those polls to the results here, you more or less get a toss-up between the two parties, maybe a small Liberal advantage. But what that really just means is that if we do end up on Monday night with a 2, 3, 4, 5-point win for the Liberals will be happy to have a win. But that still means that the country is going towards a big majority government for Pierre Poilievre, because right now, he'd probably project 210, 220 seats for the Conservatives. Toronto-St. Paul's wouldn't be one of them, but it would be a close race in that kind of scenario. So unless the Liberals are winning this by 10, 15 points, it is just corroborating what we've seen in the polls nationally and in Ontario.
So David, talk to me a little bit about that then, the fact that for a consistent period of time, your polling and others have shown the Liberals down by about 20 points from the Conservatives. Is there any coming back from that? And how much of Monday is a test of the party or the leader?
Well, I think coming back from it is always possible. I think to say nothing can happen or it's impossible it would be foolish. But to think that any party in any jurisdiction can come back from a 20-point deficit easily or with the same team that got in there, I think is harder to square, right? And the things that are important to know is not just the vote intention questions, right? We've seen a consistently negative reaction from most Canadians to the Prime Minister, to the government's certain performance. And the overall mood of the country right now is that only 1 in 4 Canadians think the country's headed in the right direction. So all of those metrics point to a deep and broad desire for change that extends into a city like Toronto, which has reliably voted Liberal, all the way to other parts of the country. So I think if the Liberals win by 10 points or more, I think then the Prime Minister can probably say, look, we can come back from this. We can convince people, persuade people to vote Liberal. If it is much closer then I think there's going to be a lot more doubt about whether he and the current team are able to achieve some of those things.
I know you talked about this on your pod, but you put the question to David, Eric, so I'll put it to you now. And that is the Prime Minister's comment to David Cochrane about people not being in decision mode. I mean, there is something to that. People are not doing a compare and contrast thing right now.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. Certainly a lot of people have not made their final decision, although we do see in polls that a lot of Canadians say that they're not going to change their mind, that they're very committed to voting Conservative primarily. We don't see as much commitment to either the Liberals or the NDP. So it's always possible that something could happen over the next year and a few months to change people's minds. But the amount of people, I think, that the pool of voters that the Liberals are working with, we've seen this in poll after poll, we've seen this in David's polling, is getting smaller and smaller. So the number of people who are still able to make the decision to vote for the Liberals, to vote for Justin Trudeau, has gotten smaller. And it is really hard to turn that trend around, because if you do look at polls really over the last 9 years since Justin Trudeau came in, with the brief exception of the pandemic, it's been a pretty steady decline, it's almost a straight line from where they started to where they are now. Yeah. You don't turn that around in just a year and 4 months because people finally tune in. You often hear this from politicians, that as soon as they hear how great we are, they'll vote for us. Yep. People are paying attention enough to know what they're not liking with the Liberal government. Does that mean that they're absolutely going to lose? No. But it does mean that if they are going to turn things around, it needs to be something significant, needs to be something major that happens to change people's minds, because those opinions are starting to get pretty solid after 9 years in power.
Yeah, well, David, talk to me about that, about whether how solidified, how baked in is the language we use, those opinions are.
Well, I just use the example anytime, think of anyone you don't really like, Rosie, like how hard is it for that person to change your opinion of them?
I like everyone, David, so that helps.
Okay, well, I'll think about myself,
yeah, okay.
right? Like, over time, that negative opinion solidifies. And in terms of the Prime Minister himself, and let's be honest, Canadian politics is largely driven by how people feel about the leaders. It's hard to change people's opinion about the Prime Minister. So I don't expect, the Prime Minister to be able to turn people's opinions of him around, right? Yeah. The thing that remains up for grabs is how people feel about Mr. Poilievre, right? There's still lots of Canadians who hold soft opinions about him, aren't really sure what he and his Conservative Party would do if they did form the next government. That is the one place left. Now, to get there, they basically have to destroy his reputation and bring him further down than the Prime Minister is, which may not be possible, because do they have the resources to do it? Can they counter the amount of money the Conservatives have to respond to that in both outside the campaign period and then in the formal campaign period? Remains to be seen.
Last word to you, Eric, on that point.
Yeah, I think that we're going to see that it's going to be very difficult for the Liberals to turn things around over the next little while. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it's an inevitable Pierre Poilievre majority government in a year, because while it's a lot to turn the polls by 20 points over a year and 4 months, you don't see that a lot. If it can get close enough that we're getting back to a minority government situation, then that is a different conversation. But I think this by-election will be a keen test of one of the things David said about whether voters are going to be enthusiastic about Pierre Poilievre. Will we see the Conservative number go up, or is this going to be a situation where Liberal voters stay home? Both are bad for the Liberals, but we might get a little bit of an indication of how voters, real voters, not just polls, are feeling about Pierre Poilievre on Monday.
Thank you. I enjoyed this. I learned so much. David Coletto and Eric Grenier, thanks very much, gentlemen.
Thanks so much.